Quick little sound check. Gonna get a little sound check, gang. Quick little sound check. While we're doing that, though, I'd like to turn your attention to Mark chapter 2, verse 23. We're up. Wonderful. Well, welcome to B-Side. We are in Mark chapter 2. If you notice my background's a little different, it's because I'm home. But anyways, welcome to B-Side, Mark chapter 2. We got a lot to get through, so let's do that. But first, we should pray. God, we ask for your help, your hand upon us, your patience, your kindness. God, help us to understand your word here and unpack it to us with a much greater depth and authority now. And give us clarity and be pleased. And in Jesus' name, amen. Mark chapter 1, the authority of Jesus. Mark chapter 2, those who resist the authority of Jesus. And this bleeds into chapter 3 and the conflicts, they're intensifying. Let's hop in here to verse 23. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, Jesus, and as they, being the disciples, made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain, and the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? And he and those who were with him. Now he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and he ate the bread of the presence, which it is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." Jesus at base level here is saying that the bread of the presence, which was sacred, was commanded by God not to be eaten by anyone except the priests. And that even if the disciples were breaking the law by picking this wheat, which they're not, but even if they were, I believe Jesus is pointing to the spirit of the law. Again, I don't think Jesus is excusing sin, but I think he's pointing to weightier matters of the law. And that's why I believe he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. That man is weightier than the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for the betterment of man, not man to serve the Sabbath. And this concept of weightier laws than other is really a strong Hebrew idea that I think we can miss if we solely focus on the New Testament, because we don't come across as many of these stories. But for example, lying. Lying is bad. Lying is very bad. And lying is bad not only because it's contrary to who the person of Christ is, who God is. God is truth. So to lie is to act like the father of lies, Satan. It's the opposite of God. So lying, bad, 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 bad. However, when we come to certain sections of the scriptures, we see that this is a little more nuanced, because not only is lying bad because it's contrary to God, lying's also bad because it's bad for humanity. And this is why we see things like low trust societies are awful. What would happen if you left a stack of $100 bills in the middle of some inner city for an hour? It's gonna get taken. Or if you leave a sports car parked with the doors open, keys in the ignition somewhere in the inner city, somewhere in a big city, almost any city in America, it's going to get taken. You do that, I mean, there's, I don't know if anyone's ever seen, like, what's going on in Dubai, but because the penalties are so extreme, I watched a video, a guy took a brand new, like, it was a Bugatti or some fancy sports car, and he put the keys to the car on the hood of the car and went into the gym and worked out. He goes, it'll be here when I get back. Like, absolutely no fear that it was going to get taken over. So low trust societies are awful when you can't trust people, when you know people are liars and schemers. It's not good. So we're told not to lie for our own good. That being said, what happened when Pharaoh wanted the Egyptian midwives to kill the Hebrew babies? Well, it says that they feared God, and as the scriptures described, the midwives lied through their teeth to Pharaoh. And it says literally, so God dealt well with the midwives. Now, again, lying's bad. I'm not saying lying's good, but what I am saying is when these midwives were placed in a position where they had to either kill babies or lie, they chose the weightier law. They chose to preserve human life, and God blessed them for it, literally. Because the weightier law was to preserve human life. Now, I want to be clear for Mark. Again, I'm not saying Jesus is saying David did nothing wrong, and you could read it that way, but I don't think that's what he's saying. But Jesus, at least to me, is describing the spirit of the law, that the Pharisees have become so wrapped up in their rigidness, in their traditions, that they've lost the heart of the scriptures. They've lost what the scriptures were entirely about. Rabbi, what is the greatest commandment? Love God, the heart of the law entirely. And of course, this will bleed into our next story with the man with the withered hand, where the Pharisees were more worried about the Sabbath rules than the well-being of the crippled man in their own synagogue. They completely missed the spirit of the law. So let's keep reading. 3:1. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. This passage marks the end of the first part of Jesus' Galilean ministry. So this story marks the end of this section. And they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. The word "they" connects us to the previous story, of course, with the Pharisees. Verse 3, and he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. So the Sabbath was meant for the good of man, but here the Pharisees are plotting murder on this Sabbath. So there's this incredible dose of irony built into this passage. The very ones who are supposed to be protecting and upholding the Sabbath have now turned it into a mechanism for murder, for the bad of the man, the very man that they should be caring about. They don't care about him. In fact, there's a sense that they want Jesus to heal him, not because they're rooting for the man, but because they want to kill Jesus. In many ways, they're actively rooting against the man. If they had their way, right, outside of bloodlust or jealousy, Jesus wouldn't heal him at all. So their priorities are completely messed up and backwards. And the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Verse 5, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of hearts, and he said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored. What does this remind us of? And Frank put in the group chat here, Josh stretched out his hand and touched the keyboard. So no, it's true. But what biblical story does this remind us of? And I want to read to you a passage from Exodus 4, verse 5. We read, "Again the Lord said to him," he's talking to Moses, "Put your hand inside your cloak." And he put his hand inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, "Put your hand back inside your cloak." And he put his hand back inside his cloak, and when he took it out, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then we read, "Then Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all of the elders of the people of Israel. Aaron spoke all the words that the Lord had spoken to Moses and did the signs in the sight of the people, and the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the people of Israel and that he had seen their affliction, they bowed their heads and worshiped. So in the story of the Exodus, the afflicted hand that was restored, Moses's, was a sign of God. A hand being restored from affliction was a sign from God of his presence with Moses. So we've just began the book of Mark, and Jesus is now just in his very first, this is the first section of his Galilean ministry. It's about to come to an end here. He's about to leave Galilee. And his sign to the people is the restoration of a withered hand. This is Exodus 4. This is the Exodus. And when Moses performs the sign of the afflicted hand's restoration, the elders of Israel, it says they believe the signs. So when Moses performs the signs before the elders of Israel, the people believe, but it says Pharaoh, his heart was hardened and he did not believe. Listen again to Mark 3:5. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of hearts, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was restored. Here the Pharisees are acting like Pharaoh. God has sent a messenger in Jesus Christ, who's also God, but he's God-man. He is the Word, the Logos, the manifest expression of Jesus. He is a messenger of God as God, but he's representing the Father. Everything I do, I do because the Father's telling him to do it. And here he does what Moses does. He restores a withered hand. And at the same time, some people believe and other people, they don't believe because of their hardness of hearts. But the inverse of the story is that the Pharisees have become Pharaoh. And he's disheartened and he's angry, which is tragically ironic. Verse 6. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. In both Matthew 12:14 and Luke 6:11, both of those stories leave out the description of the Herodians. Only Mark records this little section, this verse, about the Herodians. Why does Mark, recording Peter's eyewitness account, why does Mark include the Herodians? And we don't really know much about the Herodians. There's not much written about them in antiquity. We do know, however, from an early Roman Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, he references them as, quote, partisans of Herod, unquote, meaning Herod the Great. So the Herodians, it seems, were sympathizers and supported Herod's cause and the Herodian dynasty. Herod, of course, being ethnically Jewish, yet or being amalgamation of Rome, of all these different nationalities, but in many ways he's as a foreigner. He's someone who has no right to the throne of Israel, and is a wicked man. And so I want to close with three thoughts. First, this one's a little long, and this is what I really wanted to share on Sunday, but it just, for time's sake, it wasn't going to fit. And, you know, here's a great way to pray for me, right? I want to... Who says how long church needs to be, right? I should be able to preach for 2 hours if I want to, and I could if I wanted to. But, you know, at some point, because of the time and place that we're in, you know, you lose people. You talk too long, you lose people. They check out, they want to go. And my job as a pastor is to elevate them and try to get them, you know, to have a stronger mind for the spiritual things of God, to want and sit and learn. It's part of the reason I do these B-sides, because I'm hoping one day I'll do a long teaching. Maybe we'll have like a shorter service and then a longer service where I can fit all this stuff. But one of the things I struggle with is sometimes when I'm talking about obscure passages of scripture, or I got to do lots of other readings, I'm just afraid I'm going to lose people that are just beginning their walk. And I don't want to win some personal thing that I'm trying to do, and then lose the person. So there's always a balance of not trying to be too heady or too Bible study, and you want to be able to preach and make things in a concise, put things in a concise way. But one of the things I really wanted to get to, and we just did not have time to unpack it because it's rather lengthy, is the story that Jesus quotes in our first conflict story. And it says, and this is what Jesus says, and he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry, he and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priest to eat, but also gave it to those who were with him." Why does Jesus reference this story? That just, why this story? Not bad, but just what is happening here? Why 1 Samuel 21? And what is he saying when he references it? Because of all the things Jesus could have quoted, this is a really shocking story. And let me tell you why I think he quotes this story. Jesus, at least not primarily, if at all, is not, I don't think he's giving a commentary on whether or when, if it is ever justified to break the law, to keep weightier law. I think that's part of what's happening here. He's getting to the spirit of the law, but he's kind of vague about it, and I think that's for a purpose. He instead puts the weight of this whole thing on his authority, that if they were breaking some law, since Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, he can say it's now permissible, and what are you going to do about it? Remember Peter, he had that dream where all this unclean foods came down from a blanket, and God says, eat it. God he can abrogate any law he so chooses, and Jesus being Lord of the Sabbath, if he tells his disciples they can eat wheat, they can eat wheat. And that's where he puts the emphasis in how I taught it Sunday. But it could be that there's some weightier law stuff happening, and I do think that's part of it. But look at what Jesus says in Mark 2:26. In the time of Abiathar the high priest. And this is really tricky, because if anyone's familiar with this story from 1 Samuel 21, Abiathar was not the high priest at the time David took the bread of the presence. Jesus says, in the time of Abiathar the high priest, but Abiathar was not the high priest during this story. It was actually Abiathar's son, Ahimelech, who was it was actually Abiathar's father, Ahimelech, who was the priest at this time. And so that we don't get confused, which clearly I just did, I'm going to refer to Abiathar as son and Ahimelech as father. So we're going to use son, father. Jesus attributes it to son when really it happened at the time of the father. It wasn't Abiathar the son. The story happened during Ahimelech, the father's priesthood. And it's amazing how many scholars either claim that this is a scribal error. It was written down inappropriately. Jesus didn't mean that. Or it's amazing how many scholars actually throw up their hands, having no idea why Jesus would say Abiathar, the son, instead of Ahimelech, father. And see, I don't start reading the Bible presuming there might be a scribal error or Jesus messed up. That's not how I read the Bible. I believe if Jesus is saying son, when really it happened during the time of the Father, I believe Jesus must have a perfect reason for it because his word is perfect. And so after poking at this for a little while, I believe the reason Jesus does this, attributes this story to son and not father, is because of what happened in the story. And it's a little long, but I want to read it for you. And it's from 1 Samuel 21:1. First little coffee. Then David came to Nob, to Ahimelech the priest, and Ahimelech, father, came to meet David trembling. and said to him, "Why are you alone and no one with you?" The thought is, he knows Saul's after him, and he's scared. And David said to Father Ahimelech, the priest, the king has charged me with a matter and said to me, "Let no one know anything of the matter about which I send you and with which I have charged you. I have made an appointment with the young men for such and such a place. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever is here." And the priest answered David, "I have no common bread on hand, but there is holy bread. If the young men have kept themselves from women." You notice the priest is willing to give David the bread on a condition. And so the priest doesn't seem to be thinking that this is highly inappropriate to give David the bread. Now, it wasn't lawful. He's stretching the law, but he seems to think that there's a provision here. Maybe he's thinking of the weightier matters of the law. I don't know. Then David answered the priest, "Truly, women have been kept from us always when I go on an expedition. The vessels of the young men are holy, even when it is an ordinary journey. How much more today will their vessels be holy?" So the priest gave him the holy bread, for there was no bread there but the bread of the presence, which is removed from before the Lord to be replaced by hot bread on the day it is taken away. So it could be that David shows up on the Sabbath. David has shown up to this on the Sabbath, the day that they're getting rid of the old bread anyways. Now, the priests were still supposed to eat it in the temple, in the tabernacle, but they gave it to David instead. Again, there's a real stretching of the law here, but it seems to be the Sabbath day when they switched the bread anyways. So the priest, Ahimelech, the father, gave David the bread, which was only reserved for the priests. So then Ahimelech, the father, wanted to make sure that David and his men were not having sex with women. Otherwise, they shouldn't eat the bread. And of course, David answers, that these men are pure. And what I think is happening here, and this is a long theological study, but it seems that when men are sent to war by God, there's a sense that they are acting as a holy instrument unto the Lord. They're acting in a way as priests unto the Lord as they get into a holy war. And for the example, in Joshua 3, it says that the men were consecrated, that they were set aside as holy. Maybe not that specific language, but there's a consecration that happens to the men who are about to be sent off into battle. And the sense is that they were to be holy and that they were to cleanse the land of idolatry. It's a type of priestly work. And so David has already been anointed by Samuel. So first of all, he's a type of priestly king. He writes, remember, he dances before the ark. He writes psalms. So David's a type of priestly king. So he might be allowed to eat the bread anyways. But the men, David says that there are men on expedition. If these men were partaking in a holy war on behalf of something that God has, it could be that they were allowed to eat the bread if they were operating in a manner that they should. So I'm not saying these men weren't sinning, but there's enough here to say maybe they weren't. Again, things might have been stretched a little bit, but I'm not confident that David was sinning. And now again, he lied. He shouldn't have lied. But anyways, verse 7. 1 Samuel 21:7. Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord. His name was Doeg the Edomite, the chief of Saul's herdsmen. So a man named Doeg sees David do this, takes the bread, takes the sword of Goliath, and goes and tells King Saul in the next chapter. And as the story goes, 1 Samuel 22, now Saul heard that David was discovered and the men who were with him. And Saul was sitting at Gibeah under the tamarisk tree on the height with his spear in his hand, and all his servants were standing about him. Saul is ready to kill. And Saul said to his servant who stood about him, "Hear now, people of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards? Will he make you all commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds, that all of you have conspired against me? No one discloses to me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is sorry for me or discloses to me what my son has stirred up with my servants against me to lie in wait as at this day." Then Doeg the Edomite, who stood by the servants of Saul, I saw the son of Jesse coming to Nob, to Ahimelech, father, the son of Ahitub, grandfather. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. Then the king sent to summon Ahimelech, father, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were at Nob, and all of them came to the king. And Saul said, "Hear now, son of Ahitub." And he answered, "Here I am, my lord." And Saul said to him, "Why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he has risen against me to lie in wait at this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king, "And who among your servants is so faithful as David? Who is the king's son-in-law and captain over your bodyguard and honored in your house? Is today the first time that I have inquired of God for him? No. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to all the house of my father, for your servant has known nothing of all of this, much or little." And the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house." And the king said to the guard who stood about him, "Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David." And they knew that he fled and did not disclose it to me. But the servants of the king would not put out their hand to strike the priests of the Lord. Now listen to this. This is crazy. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn and strike the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned and struck down the priests, and he killed on that day 85 persons who wore the linen ephod. And Nob, the city of the priests, he put to the sword both man and woman and child and infant, ox, donkey, sheep he put to the sword. But one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, son, is the priest that Jesus put the emphasis on, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar, son, told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. And David said to Abiathar, son, "I knew on that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I have occasioned the death of all the servants of your father's house. Stay with me. Do not be afraid, for he who seeks my life seeks your life. With me you shall be in safekeeping." All right, we're done our reading. Jesus connects his disciples eating wheat to the story of David eating wheat, eating bread. But a feature that I believe is also in this story are who are the Pharisees. I believe Jesus, the reason he quotes this story by quoting this story, he's saying that the Pharisees who are objecting to the wheat are like David's accusers. They are like Saul with a spear in his hand, or Doeg the tattletale. And the reason I believe Jesus attributes this story to Abiathar, the son, is not because Jesus misspoke or made some scribe made a mistake, but is Jesus' way of telling the Pharisees who they really are. Jesus knows exactly what he's doing. The Pharisees act more like the Pharisees act like they're the ones that are fighting for righteousness. That they pretend to be loyal to the kingdom. That they're the ones who pretend to uphold justice in the land. Maybe they really believe it, when really they're just like Saul and Doeg. They are the ones who accuse and pursue and plot and crush the righteous. They are evil leaders. Like Doeg, they watch at the temple seeking to get dirt. Like Saul, they plot the murder of the innocent and will demand the death of the high priest. But remember, Jesus, referencing 1 Samuel 21 and 22, continues into the story of the healing of the man with the withered hand. And at the end of the story of the man with the withered hand, because remember, these two stories are meant to be connected, Mark 3:6, the Pharisees went out, held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. And here is what is so fascinating to me, is if the Pharisees are like Saul, well, then now we understand why Mark is the only one who records the reference to the Herodians, to the role of the Herodians, and why Mark records their name. Because they're like Doeg. The just as Saul used Doeg to kill God's high priest, and priests, plural, so will the Pharisees use the foreigner, Herod, and the Herodians, those loyal to Herod and Rome, to kill Jesus and eventually many of the disciples. So here's what I think's happening. Here is Jesus, and he is calling the Pharisees and the Herodians Saul and Doeg. As Saul sat there and that spear in his hand, he wants the death of David. And he's willing to make an alliance. He's willing to call upon the foreigner to kill him. And here are the Pharisees, like Saul. They are the religious leaders of Israel, the rulers of Israel, and yet they sit there with spears in their hand, metaphorically. They are ready to kill David, the son of David, Jesus Christ. And when the people won't do it, when no one else will accomplish it, or maybe they can't, they make allegiances here in Mark chapter 3 with Doeg the Edomite, with the Herodians. They start to plot to kill the high priest. And as the book of Acts goes, they will kill many priests of the Lord and many of the disciples. So there's an unholy alliance happening here. Okay. Fascinating. I didn't want to lose anybody on Sunday, but I was all fired up about that. Our second point here, we got a long B-side today. Charles Spurgeon once said, do not tell me what you know, tell me what you have done with what you know. Do not tell me about your new doctrine. Let me see the fruit of it in your life. The Pharisees were typically brilliant. They would have the first 5 books of the Bible memorized, of course. The commentaries memorized. They were very smart, and yet they knew very little. Jesus says, haven't you read? And he said this because though they memorized the scriptures, they didn't really know the scriptures. They didn't understand they understood the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. They had all head knowledge, no heart knowledge. And again, what a warning to us that we must not simply know the word, we have to live it. That we must not simply learn of Jesus Christ, we must follow him and build our life upon him. And here are the Pharisees. And here is a man in their synagogue with a deformed hand, and not one of them is rooting for this man to get healed, at least not for the sake of the man. And they could probably each write a 500-page book, the Pharisees, on compassion, on mercy throughout the Old Testament. And yet here they are proving that they have applied none of it to their own lives. They're rooting against a man getting healed. Very much like, in some ways, like a college professor teaching Business 101, having never run a business. They act like they are experts of the law, yet they haven't applied any of it. Don't tell me what you know. Show me what you know. And many Christians are this way. They wear cross necklaces and they attend church, and that's great. But are you living life in light of the cross? Are you living life in as the true bride? You see, we must be careful. We do not want to have the appearance of godliness, but are devoid of its power. And just to be clear, because we don't want to swing too far the other way, knowledge is not the enemy. Knowledge is good. You should learn as much as you can. and learn as many deep things of theology as you can, that's a good thing. But it's also not a replacement for a relationship with the Lord. And this is really important to me as a pastor. I take this very seriously because pastors really get into a horrible trap where they pick up their Bible and after time they only read it to try to figure out how to preach it. They read it in a way as to how to apply it to the people of their congregation, and they lose it for themselves. And this is not good. This is one of the reasons why I have a personal devotion every day for me. Because the number one thing you need from your pastor is not oratory skills or business savvy or anything else. It's that I'm a godly man. I have to be living the truths of Scripture. Augustine said, your true religion is what you do with your solitude. Or what he means is when no one's looking. And so we really have to be diligent in our walk with the Lord. We have to make sure we don't lose the preciousness of the most basic tenets of Christianity. You don't ever move beyond the cross. You don't ever move beyond forgiveness and creation. We don't want to lose the life-altering power that is in those things and get all puffed up with head knowledge and no heart knowledge. So we need to make sure that we're really living this. Otherwise, what good does it do us? It proves that we don't really know it at all. And then thirdly, and one more thing before we go, very clearly in the book of Revelation and the rest of the Bible, there's an intimate connection between big government and Satan's agenda and the Antichrist's agenda. We see that with Pharaoh, or the mark of the beast, not being able to buy or sell anything outside of governmental approval, or, of course, Babylon, or the beast's armies at Armageddon. Big government is part of the Antichrist agenda. We don't want big government as Christians. But at the same time, very clearly throughout the book, well, all right, let me pause. We may want big government if it was Christian government, but that's a whole nother discussion there. But at the same time, very clearly throughout the book of Revelation and the rest of the Bible, we see a connection between false religion and Satan's agenda, the Antichrist agenda. So as Satan plans to use big government for his goals, so Satan uses false religion for his goals. In the scripture, we see that those who receive the mark of the beast are forced to worship the beast or die. We see the false prophet leading people into worship the abomination of desolation. We see this all throughout the Old Testament in the worship of Baal and at the Asherahs. And as we look at today's passage, we see the Pharisees sitting in church watching Jesus, and in many ways are actively rooting against the healing of this cripple for their agenda. Here is Jesus. He has walked into the synagogue, into their religious institutions, the God-man who has the ability to heal one of their parishioners, and they're rooting against the man with the withered hand. In fact, they're thinking if Jesus does this, he should receive the death penalty. James, in James 1:26 says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Now listen to this. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the word. What James is poking at is that true Christianity is to invest in the least of society, in the downtrodden, in the needy, to help those that may never be able to help you back. And here Jesus, he looks at this man with a deformity, and he shows his deep love and care for him. But the Pharisees look at this deformed man as a means to an end, as a pawn to move on the board towards their agenda. For example, I was just listening to a podcast of an Iraqi war veteran, and he said in Iraq, there was a real problem with car bombing. So there's, when we invaded in Iraq, of course, Desert Storm, and then, of course, later, Americans would have checkpoints all over the cities and at their base camps. And Muslims, the Muslim men, would sometimes drive up to these checkpoints with huge bombs in their car and blow up and kill our men that were guarding the checkpoints. And it was a real problem for Americans. It costed us a lot of lives. But at the same time, Americans also intercepted a lot of these bombs, these car bombs, before they blew up. And one of the things that they realized early on is that a lot of these suicide car bombers were actually zip tied or tied to the seats, to the steering wheels. That they were being forced to blow themselves up, or their families would be murdered, or something horrible would happen to them. And of course, their religious leaders were telling them, but if you do this, you'll go to heaven, you'll get a planet with virgins, Allah will bless you. And what's happened, they're duct taping them to seats. They're zip tying them to seats. And so they were used as pawns by their religious leaders. They were some means to some end. It's religious manipulation and abuse. I think of the 1500s with the Catholic Church and this major uptick in its increased sales of indulgences. Of course, indulgences, you would throw money at towards charity at the Catholic Church, and you could buy time out of purgatory, a place the Catholic Church invented. It's not in the Bible. And why? Why? To fund the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome was an enormous project that required vast sums of money. And so the church needed to raise capital. And how did they do that? By trying to increase the sales of indulgences. And they would send out preachers like Johann Tetzel. And he had a slogan as he would go around to villages. He would say slogans like, as soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. And again, this is religious manipulation. The Pharisees had turned religious, and thinking of the Pharisees here, the Pharisees had turned religion into something other than what it should be. It became it became burdensome. It became a means to control the masses, a means to seize power. And it had gotten so bad that it got to the point where even the healing of a crippled man outside of their permission became a crime punishable by death. And in the end times, those who refuse to receive the mark of the beast, to worship the abomination of desolation, they will be put to death. So this is Satan's plan. We see it all through the Bible. Yes, he wants to weaponize the Herodians. He wants to weaponize big government and Herod and Pilate. But he also wants to weaponize religion, false religion, towards his agenda and against Christ's church. And this is how it was in the time of Jesus. It's how it was throughout the latter New Testament, throughout the early church, throughout the Middle Ages. Now, Satan's plan is to weaponize big government, big religion against God's true people. And we need to be clear, and we need to be sharp, and make sure that we understand what's happening, and that none of this is happening on accident. Satan is working throughout the background. I was talking to my wife yesterday about that Rolling Stones song, Symphony of the Devil. It's woo-hoo, pleased to meet you, won't you guess my name? And I was, she's like, I know the song, but I don't know what it's about. And I was explaining how it talked about all these horrible moments throughout human history, but someone was orchestrating it. And, of course, won't you guess my name? It's Satan. It's Symphony of the Devil. And the same thing's true with church abuse. We see all these pastors and sexual sins, and we see priests molesting children, really horrible things. We see financial abuses, not good. But we have to understand Satan's at work. And of course he's going to go after the bride of Christ. Of course he's going to try to mar her reputation. He's a slanderer. He's been a liar and a slanderer from the beginning. And here we see this really profoundly in our gospel reading today. So that's it. We made it. I have no idea what time it is. How long did we do this? 48 minutes and you guys hung in there. You're the best. You're the bee's knees, the cat's meow. Anyways, let's pray and we'll get going on with our day. God, we love you. We praise you. We thank you. We ask that you be with us today. We ask that you bless us today, restore us today, help us to do a good work today. And we love you deeply, God, deeply. So be with us now and rest us now. Help us to do a good work. And in Jesus' name, we love you. Amen. All right, gang. I love you guys so much. I'll see you Sunday.